You're not worth my time anymore. Get out. My mother said it the way you'd tell a stray to get off the porch. Not angry. Bored almost. We were standing at the back of a funeral home in a town too small to hold a stoplight, and the man in the open casket 30 feet away was my father. It was a little after 2 in the afternoon on a gray Tuesday, and there were 41 folding chairs set up in that room. I counted them when I walked in. I count things when I don't know what to do with my hands. I didn't answer her. You learn, after enough years, that you don't cry when you take a hit. You breathe. You find the exits. There were 2 in that room, the front doors and a fire door behind the flower stand, and I'd clocked both of them before I ever saw my mother's face. I bit down until I tasted copper, and I kept my back straight, and I said nothing. That was the only thing I'd ever figured out how to give her that she couldn't take back. My silence. She smoothed the front of her black dress with both hands, a slow ironing motion she's done my whole life, and she turned back toward the mourners like I was already gone. I would have gone. I'd already turned toward the door. And that's when a man I'd never seen before, old, tall in a gray suit that had fit him 20 pounds ago, put his hand very lightly on my sleeve. Miss Brennan, he said. Not a question. Don't leave the county yet. Your father left instructions. Not for today. He pressed a business card into my palm, closed my fingers over it like he was hiding it from the room, and walked back to his seat before I could say a word. I stood in a funeral home parking lot for a long time after that, in the cold, holding a stranger's card, listening to a delivery truck somewhere behind the building beep every 4 seconds as it backed up. Beep. 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 I remember thinking the whole world just keeps backing up, warning everybody, and nobody ever moves. I'm going to tell you what my father left. I'm going to tell you about the sealed envelope, and the recording, and the one piece of paper that made my mother sit down in the middle of a room full of people and forget how to breathe. But none of it makes sense unless you understand the house I grew up in. You have to understand that my mother didn't start hating me at that funeral. She'd had 40 years of practice. And you have to understand that the daughter she threw out of that room was the only person in it who was actually hers. To get there, I have to take you back a long way. Back before the uniform, before the deployments, before I learned exactly how quiet a family can be while it's deciding you don't count. My sister Meredith is 3 years older than me, and for most of my childhood she was the only weather in our house. When she was happy, we had sun. When she wasn't, everybody carried an umbrella. My mother arranged her whole life around Meredith's moods the way some people arrange furniture around a television. I was the other one. Not the bad one exactly. Just the one who didn't match the set. Meredith was gold literally. She had this pale gold hair nobody else in the family had. And my mother used to run her fingers through it at the dinner table like she was petting something valuable. I have my father's dark hair and my father's flat, careful way of looking at things, and I think that was the first strike against me, though it took me 30 years to understand why. There's a photograph that used to sit on the mantel. My parents on their wedding day, and then, tucked into the corner of the frame, a smaller picture of Meredith as a baby. I used to stare at it as a kid without knowing what bothered me. Later I'd do the arithmetic. My mother always said Meredith came a little early. A little early is one thing. The picture was another. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then it was just a photo I wasn't in. I can give you the exact afternoon I learned my rank in that house. I was 9, and I'd won a ribbon at school for a science thing, I don't even remember what. Some contraption with a battery and a bell. I ran the whole way home with it. My mother was at the counter helping Meredith with a costume for a pageant, a mouthful of pins, pinning gold fabric, and when I held up the ribbon she looked at it and then at me and said, "Around the pins, put it on the fridge," then not unkind. "Just done." She turned back to the gold fabric. My father took the ribbon that night when he got home, and he looked at it for a long time under the kitchen light, and he put it in his shirt pocket instead of on the fridge, and he never said a word about it. I found it in his tackle box after he died, 20 years later, soft as cloth from being carried. He'd kept a 9-year-old science ribbon in a tackle box for 30 years. I want you to hold on to that, because it's the whole story in miniature. The loud nothing from one of them, and the silent everything from the other. My father worked at the water treatment plant for 31 years and said maybe 100 words a day, and I loved him with the kind of uncomplicated animal loyalty you only get to feel before you're old enough to know better. He had a cabin on the far side of the lake, one room, a wood stove, a dock that leaned. His father had built it. It was paid off and it was his, separate from the house, separate from my mother, and it was the only place I ever saw him look like a whole person. He'd take me out on that lake before dawn and we wouldn't talk for hours. He taught me to clean a fish with a brass-handled jackknife he kept in his front pocket, worn smooth as a river stone. Slow is smooth. He'd say the only fishing advice he ever gave me, and it turned out to be advice about a lot more than fish. Here's a thing about being the child who doesn't count. You get very good at reading a room, because your safety depends on it. I could tell you my mother's mood from the sound of her setting down a coffee cup. And I knew that when she was about to say something cruel, she'd smooth the tablecloth first, both hands, like she was wiping the table clean before she put the knife down. I've watched her do it my entire life. Wipe the table. Then cut. When I was 18, I left. I'd like to tell you it was some brave decision, but the truth is quieter than that. I'd applied to the army the way other kids apply to colleges 3 states away, as a way out that nobody could argue with. The morning I left, my mother stayed in her room. My father walked me to the driveway, and he didn't hug me, because we didn't do that. He took the jackknife out of his pocket, the one from the boat, and he pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers over it the exact same way. I'd realized 23 years later that a stranger in a gray suit would close my fingers over a business card. Slow is smooth, he said. And that was goodbye. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make myself sound like a hero, and I wasn't one. I was a scared kid who found out she was good at something. I ended up in intelligence, the kind of work where you sit in a windowless room and read the shape of things out of numbers and photographs, and the small lies people tell in their own paperwork. I was good at it the way I'd been good at reading my mother's coffee cup. It's the same skill. You watch what people do, not what they say, and you wait. I stayed in for 20 years. I got promoted past ranks my family never bothered to learn the names of. There was one night, on a base I can't name, when the rockets came in and a building came down and I went back into it and pulled 2 people out, and there's a medal in a drawer somewhere because of that night. I never told anyone at home. Not because it was secret, most of it wasn't, but because telling them felt like begging. Like holding up a report card to a woman who'd already decided the grade. So I let them believe the small version. My mother told people I did some desk job overseas. She told them I'd run off and abandoned the family. And every year the story got a little smoother, a little more settled, until even relatives who'd known me as a child looked at me like a rumor they'd mostly stopped believing. I let her. That was my mistake, and I want you to see it clearly, because it's the real one. I told myself that staying quiet, staying gone, was a kind of kindness, that I was sparing everyone the friction of me. I actually believed that disappearing was the loving thing to do. There's one more thing you should know about those years, because it matters later. For a long time I sent money home. Not a fortune, a warrant officer isn't rich, but a few $100s a month into a joint account my father had set up back when I first enlisted. For the cabin, he said. For the taxes and the roof, and whatever the lake tried to take back each winter. I never told my mother. I didn't want the conversation. I just wanted the dock to still be standing if I ever got to come home. I found out much later that the account had been emptied and refilled and emptied again. That money had moved through it like water through a cracked hull, and that for the last 2 years of my father's life, the person with her hand on the drain was my sister. But I didn't know that yet. When you're far away, you assume the people at home are doing their best. It's a comfortable thing to assume. It lets you stay far away. So that was the shape of it, the day the phone finally rang. A man in a small town, dying by inches. A wife who'd spent 40 years making sure the wrong daughter felt like a guest. A gold-haired sister at the center of everything. And me, the dark-haired one, The one who read numbers for a living and couldn't read her own family. About to fly home to a house that had already decided I didn't belong in it. I thought the worst thing waiting for me was going to be grief. I had no idea. The call came on a Wednesday. My mother didn't make it, Meredith did. And even then it wasn't really to tell me. It was to manage me. Dad's not doing well, she said. There's nothing to do. Don't upend your life. Translation. Stay where you are. I got on a plane the next morning. The disease had a long name, but what it did was simple and cruel. It took my father's hands first. The hands that had cleaned 1,000 fish, that had built nothing but repaired everything, started to shake so badly that by the time I got home he couldn't sign his own name or hold a pen long enough to write a sentence. He could still talk, on the good days. He just couldn't write. Remember that. It matters. When the neurologist first tried to figure out what was taking him, they ran a genetic panel on all of us, my mother, Meredith, me, to see what was hereditary and what wasn't. Standard these days. My father asked for copies of everything. Every page. And my mother thought it was just a sick man wanting to feel in control of something. It wasn't. He was finally asking a question he'd been too afraid to ask for 40 years, and a laboratory answered it in a language my mother couldn't smooth over. They'd set him up in the front room in a rented hospital bed, and my sister had moved back into the house to take care of things. That phrase did a lot of work. Taking care of things meant Meredith had my father's power of attorney. She'd gotten it early, while he could still agree to it, back when agreeing to things was still easy for him. Taking care of things meant she paid the bills, opened the mail, decided who came and went. Taking care of things meant that when I flew across the country to sit with my dying father, I had to be let in. My mother met me at the door and looked at me the way you look at a solicitor. He's tired, she said. Don't get him worked up. She smoothed the front of her cardigan with both hands. Wipe the table. I stepped past her. He knew me. That's the thing I'll always have. However far gone he got, whatever the disease scrambled, when I sat down by that bed and took his shaking hand, his face changed like a light coming on in a house you thought was empty. There she is, he said. 3 words. It was more than my mother had given me in 20 years. There was a hospice nurse who came those last weeks, a heavy-set woman named Renata who hummed hymns under her breath while she worked and treated my father like a person instead of a task. One night I couldn't sleep, and I found her in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and we didn't say much, just drank bad coffee at the counter. At one point she nodded toward the front room and said, "He talks about you when the other 2 aren't here." Not her. Not the blonde one. You, she said it plainly, the way you'd mentioned the weather, and then she went back to humming. I've thought about that 100 times since. A stranger paid by the hour saw in 3 weeks what my family spent 40 years pretending not to. That's the thing about the people who show up for the actual work of loving somebody. They can't help but notice who's really there. On one of the good afternoons, with my mother out and my sister on the phone in the kitchen arguing with somebody in a low, tight voice, my father pulled my hand close and got very serious. His eyes were clear that day. "Listen to me," he said. "There's a lawyer. Voss. In town." Theirs in his hand shook, and he lost the words, and his face crumpled with the frustration of a man whose own body kept hanging up on him mid-sentence. "There's something at Voss's office. For you. When it's time. Not before. You'll know." He squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. "Promise me you won't let your mother be there when you open it." I promised. I didn't understand, but I promised. You don't ask a dying man to explain himself. You just say yes. I have to tell you about the kitchen counter, because this is where the intelligence work and the daughter work became the same job again. On my 3rd day home, waiting for the coffee to finish, I looked down at a stack of mail my sister hadn't gotten to. There was a letter from the bank. Not a statement, a notice. The kind of letter with a due date in it. And underneath it, a home equity statement showing a balance on a house I'd grown up believing my parents owned free and clear. I didn't touch it. I've spent my career learning not to touch the thing that tells you the room is not what it seems. I took out my phone and I photographed it. Then I photographed the 2 pieces of mail under it. Then I put the stack back exactly the way it had been, squared to the edge of the counter, and I poured my coffee, and when my sister came back in, I asked her how she was holding up. She said, "It's a lot." I said I could imagine. I couldn't yet, but I would. Over the next week, I learned to read my sister the way I'd learned to read my mother. Meredith ran a gallery 2 towns over, beautiful place, wine on the walls, the kind of business that photographs well and bleeds money. She was on the phone with creditors more than she was with the hospice nurse. I heard a number through a closed door once, said in a voice trying very hard to stay calm. $180,000. I heard her say, "It's handled. The estate will cover it." Just "it's handled." I heard her say the estate the way a drowning person says the name of a boat. I didn't confront her. I want you to notice that, because I know how it looks. I had photographs of a plundered account and a mortgaged house and a sister drowning in debt, and I said nothing. Part of it was that my father was still alive, and I was not going to spend his last week starting a war over his hospital bed. But part of it, the honest part, was the old sickness. The belief that if I just stayed quiet, if I just made myself small and useful and gone, everyone would be better off. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I was really just doing the thing I'd always done. Disappearing. He died on a Sunday morning, early at the hour we used to fish. The nurse said it was peaceful. I wasn't in the room. My mother had sent me to the pharmacy on an errand that could have waited, and I let her, because I was still, at 41 years old, trying not to get him worked up. I have to live with that. I got back and the bed was empty and my chance to be there was gone, and my mother looked at me over her coffee and said, "You always did have bad timing." Let me go back to the funeral for a second, because I skipped the part that tells you who these people really are. I hadn't planned to wear the uniform. I don't. Usually it feels like a costume in a room full of people who never asked. But that morning, standing in a motel bathroom, I put it on. I told myself it was respect for my father, and that was part of it. The other part was harder to admit. I wanted, one time, to walk into that family looking like the size I actually am. It backfired the way I should have known it would. When I came in, I heard my aunt whisper to a cousin, "Well, look who decided to play soldier." My mother's face did something complicated and then settled into contempt. And Meredith actually laughed, a small bright social laugh, and said, loud enough to carry, "She loves the attention." She always has. In a room where I was the only one who'd worn black for a living, they'd decided the medals were the lie. There was an old man near the casket, a friend of my father's from the plant, and he looked at Meredith for a long moment and then at me, and he said something quiet to his wife that I only half caught. "Funny," he said. "She never did favor either of them. That girl." He meant Meredith. He meant her gold hair and her fine features that came from nowhere in that room. It landed on me like a splinter you don't feel going in. I didn't defend myself. And I want to be clear that this wasn't strength, not yet. It was habit. I stood at the back and let my mother's version of me fill the room, because I'd been letting it fill rooms for 20 years, and I didn't know how to do anything else. When she told me to get out, some part of me was almost relieved. It was the ending I understood. And then a hand on my sleeve, and a card, and a dead man's instructions, and a delivery truck beeping into the cold like the world warning everybody about nothing. I drove to Mr. Voss's office the next morning. Mr. Voss's office was above the hardware store, up a flight of stairs that complained the whole way, in a room that smelled like old paper and older coffee. When I got there the next morning, my family was already assembled, and the temperature of the room dropped about 10 degrees when I walked in. My mother stood up. "This is a family matter," she said. "You can wait outside." Meredith was in the good chair by the window, and there was an uncle I barely knew on the small sofa, already dressed like he was expecting to sign for something. Mr. Voss did not look up from the folder in front of him. "Miss Brennan is named in these documents," he said mildly. "She stays. Please sit down, Carol." He had the flat, unbothered voice of a man who has sat across from grieving families for 40 years and is no longer moved by the theater of them. My mother sat. Voss squared a stack of papers against the desk, the same way I square mail against a counter, and he began. He walked us through the house, first the furniture, the accounts, the car, and it went where everyone expected it to go. To my mother, which in that family meant it went to Meredith by a shorter road. My sister's shoulders came down half an inch. I watched her let herself believe it was over. Then Mr. Voss turned a page and said, "That covers the estate. The cabin is separate." The room got quiet in a specific way. "The cabin and the shoreline parcel are not part of the estate," he said. Mr. Brennan filed a transfer on death deed on that property some years ago. A deed like that doesn't pass through this room. It passed the day he signed it. On his death, that property transfers directly, outside the will, to his named beneficiary. He looked at me for the first time. "To you, Nora." Meredith reached for her water glass and misjudged it and knocked it over. Nobody moved to clean it up. My mother said, in a voice gone thin, "That's not possible." He wouldn't. She started to smooth her skirt with both hands, and stopped, the gesture frozen half-finished in her lap, as if some part of her had finally learned what it meant. I said nothing. This is the part I'm proudest of, and I know how strange that sounds. I had waited 20 years to be handed one thing in that family, and when it finally came, I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. I just sat there and let the deed be true. Voss wasn't finished. "There's the matter of the accounts," he said, and now something in the room began to tilt. "As executor, I'm required to account for the estate's assets, and the estate's assets are considerably diminished. Over the past 2 years, the joint accounts were drawn down to almost nothing, and a home equity line was opened against the house. All of it executed under power of attorney. He let that sit. By you, Meredith." Meredith's mouth opened. "That was for his care," she said. "That was the estate will." "There is no estate to speak of," Voss had said gently. "That's what I'm telling you. And a man's care doesn't cost a gallery's worth of unpaid invoices." He said it the way careful men state facts they've had a long time to get used to, not cruelly, just plainly. Meredith laughed, then the small, bright social laugh, the one she'd used on me my whole life, and said, "Then prove it." She said the bank statements had gone through the shredder months ago, in the ordinary way, that there was nothing left on paper to tie a single dollar to her. She was almost right. I reached into my bag and set 3 photographs on the desk. The bank notice, the equity statement, the account, emptied, each one dated. Each one shot in that kitchen the week she thought I was just a house guest who counted the chairs. I'd photographed the originals before she ever fed them to the machine. Voss looked at the images a long moment, then at me. "These are the only copies that exist," he said quietly. "And they're admissible." Meredith stared at the photos and then at me. And for the first time in our lives, she looked at me like I was a person who might be dangerous. "You were spying on us," she said. "I was reading the mail," I said. It was the only full sentence I spoke in that room. I'd already said the rest of it weeks before with a phone, and a steady hand, to no one at all. And then Mr. Voss said the thing that made all of it the deed. The money. The 20 years reorganize itself into a shape none of us had ever seen. "There's one more document," he said. Mr. Brennan was insistent about it. When his illness was diagnosed, the family was tested, and he requested that the findings be entered with the estate, because they bear on his wishes. He slid a single sheet from the folder. The testing establishes 2 things. First, that Nora is his biological daughter. He paused. And second, that Meredith is not. I have been in rooms when the shooting started. I know what a certain kind of silence sounds like. This was that. My uncle stood up and then didn't know why he'd stood up and sat back down. Meredith turned her whole body toward the window, away from all of us, her gold hair catching the light, and she did not make a sound. And my mother put one hand flat over her mouth and left it there. Over the top of it, her eyes found me and stayed, not blinking. The way you look at a thing you've been out running so long you'd half forgotten it had legs of its own. Her other hand had started the old motion down the front of her skirt, wiped the table and stopped, halfway, and stayed stopped. She smoothed nothing. For the first time in my life, she had nothing left to wipe clean. Somewhere below us, in the hardware store, a bell on the door rang as a customer came in, and it was such an ordinary sound Tuesday. A man buying screws that it made the room we were sitting in feel like a building on fire that nobody was allowed to run from. My sister's water was still spreading across the desk toward the folder, and Mr. Voss lifted the papers out of its path without hurrying, the way you'd move something valuable out of the reach of a tide. Nobody looked at me like I'd won anything. That's the truth. There was no triumph in that room. There was just a family discovering, all at once, that the story it had told about itself was a lie, and that the daughter it had spent a lifetime treating like a guest was the only one at that table who had ever actually belonged to the man in the ground. I didn't say, "You threw out the wrong daughter." I thought it. God, I thought it. But saying it would have made it about her, and I was done making things about her. I looked at Mr. Voss and I ignored my mother's eyes, and I asked him the only thing I wanted to know. Is that everything he left? Voss looked at me for a moment with something that might have been respect. No, he said. He reached into a drawer and took out a small padded envelope, worn at the corners, my name on the front in a handwriting I barely recognized, because the letters shook. This is for you. He was very specific. You're to open it alone. He held it out across the desk. Not here. I took it. It weighed almost nothing, and it weighed everything. I stood up, and I walked out past my mother and my sister and my confused uncle, down the stairs that complained the whole way, and I did not look back, because there was nothing behind me anymore but a room full of people learning who they really were. I didn't open the envelope right away. I want to tell you how I raced home and tore into it, but that's not what happened. I put it on the passenger seat of the rental car and I drove out to the cabin, my cabin now. A sentence I couldn't make fit in my mouth, and I sat on the leaning dock in the cold with my father's jackknife in my hand and the unopened envelope beside me, and I let myself not be ready for a while. Some things you have to walk up on slowly. Slow is smooth. I've had a few weeks now to think about what happened in that office, and I want to be honest with you about the parts that don't sit clean. Because I don't trust stories where everything lands neatly and the right people cry at the right time. Here's the first hard thing. Everyone in that room got a version of the truth that day, and it wrecked them differently. My sister didn't just lose the money in the house. She lost a father a man she'd buried the week before turned out, on paper, to have never been hers at all. And the person who'd let her believe otherwise for 44 years was the same mother who'd spent those years teaching her to look down on me. Meredith was cruel to me my whole life, and I have caught myself, more than once since, feeling something I did not expect to feel toward her, which is sorry. She was raised to be the son in a house built on a lie, and nobody ever asked her if she wanted the job. Here's the second hard thing, and this one is about my father, and I still don't know what to do with it. He knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough, and for a long time. He knew what my mother had done, and he knew what my sister was doing to his accounts. And he knew, I think, how that house had always treated me. And what he did about it was this. He drove to a lawyer's office one quiet afternoon, and he arranged everything so that the truth would come out after he was safely gone. He protected me. I don't doubt that he loved me. But he loved me from behind a locked door, in documents, in a recording, in a deed filed where no argument could reach him. He never once, while he was alive and could still see my face, stood up in that house and said, out loud, that I was his and that I mattered. He left me the truth the way a man leaves money under a mattress for a child he's afraid to be seen loving. I've decided I'm allowed to be grateful and angry at the same time. I think that might be the most grown-up thing I've learned out of all of this, that you can hold what someone gave you and what they couldn't give you in the same two hands, and you don't have to set either one down to carry the other. And here's the thing I got wrong, the one that's mine. For 20 years I told myself that going quiet, going small, going away, was a gift to my family, that I was sparing them the trouble of me. I believed my silence was a kind of love. It wasn't. My silence was just a room where their version of me could grow without anyone ever opening a window. All those years I thought I was keeping the peace. I was only keeping the lie comfortable. Disappearing isn't the same thing as forgiving. It's just a quieter way of agreeing that you don't count. People will tell you the best revenge is winning. Standing in that office, holding a deed to the one place my father ever looked whole, watching a lifetime of contempt come apart in real time, I promise you, it did not feel like winning. It felt like a room full of people finally seeing a thing that had always been true. That's all I ever actually wanted. Not to beat them. To be seen. And it turns out you can't make people see you by getting smaller. You do it by standing exactly your own size and letting the facts stand next to you. I should tell you what became of the rest of it, in the weeks after, because life doesn't end when the secret does. It just keeps going. More honestly, my mother did not apologize. I don't think she knows how. What she did instead was call me, once, and leave a message in a voice I'd never heard from her, small, and old, and stripped of all the smoothing. She said, "I did what I thought I had to." That was the whole message. Not "I'm sorry." Not "you were right." Just a woman explaining herself to the daughter she'd thrown away, 40 years too late, into a phone that couldn't answer her back. I've listened to it more times than I'll admit. I still don't know what I feel. Word got around town the way it does. In a place that small, a secret that old doesn't just fall on the people in the room. It falls on everyone who ever repeated the story. Relatives who'd looked at me like a rumor started calling. An aunt cried on the phone and told me she'd always wondered. I let her wonder out loud. I didn't need the apologies. Exactly, but I'd spent a long time being the villain in a story I never wrote. And there's a particular quiet that comes when the record finally gets corrected. Not triumph. Just quiet. The good kind at last. But none of that is the part I carry. Part I carry was in a padded envelope, in my father's shaking handwriting, and it was his voice. Inside the envelope was a small recorder, the cheap kind you buy at a drugstore, and a note card with 4 words on it in handwriting that climbed uphill and fell back down again. For when I'm gone. That was all his hands could manage. He'd said the rest out loud, because his voice held on longer than his grip did. I sat on the dock and I pressed play, and my father talked to me for 6 minutes. I'm not going to give you all of it. Some of it belongs only to me. But I'll tell you that the first thing he said, before anything about the money or the deed or my mother, was this. He said, "I know what you did over there. That night the building came down. I know you went back in for those boys. Nobody had to tell me. I always knew what you were." His voice shook the disease. "And something else. You never once bragged about the biggest thing you ever did. That's how I know I raised one of you right." He'd known. All those years I thought I was holding up an ungraded report card, and he'd already seen the grade. And he'd been proud of me in a house where being proud of me out loud was not allowed. He apologized on that tape. He said he should have been braver while he could still look at me. He said the cabin was mine because it was the only place he'd ever managed to be honest, and he wanted his honest place to go to his honest child. And then, near the end, his voice very tired, he asked me for one thing. "Look after Dana," he said. "My sister's girl. My niece. 12 years old, all elbows, mad about fishing, and by the paper in that lawyer's folder, no more his blood than a stranger's. She didn't do any of this," my father said. "She's just a kid in a house full of grown-ups' lies. Take her out on the water. Teach her the knife. She's the one who reminds me of you. So here's what I did with my revenge. I could have pressed it. I want you to understand that. What my sister did with that power of attorney is the kind of thing that ends with lawyers and charges, and Mr. Voss told me, carefully, that I would have every right. For about a week I held that right in my hand like a loaded thing, and I felt how good it would feel to use it. I didn't use it. Not because Meredith deserved mercy, I genuinely don't know if she did. I didn't use it because a dying man asked me to take a little girl fishing. And because burning my sister down to the ground would have burned that child right along with her. And because I was finally done letting my mother's house decide what kind of person I was going to be. I let them keep the house. I kept the cabin. And I told my mother one thing, the last real thing I've said to her, in a message left after the message she left me. "You can know where I am," I said. You don't get to decide who I am anymore. Then I hung up, and I drove out to the lake, and I waited for Saturday. Dana comes out to the cabin now, most weekends. She's terrible at it and getting better. Last week I stood behind her on the leaning dock at the hour my father and I used to fish, and I took his brass jackknife out of my pocket worn smooth as a river stone, older than both of us, and I opened it and showed her how to whittle a plug. Slow, always slow, because slow is smooth. The light came up gold over the water, the one place in my whole life that color has ever felt like it belonged to me. And for the first time I could remember, I wasn't counting the exits. That's the part nobody warns you about. You spend so long bracing against the door that you forget doors also let you out into somewhere better. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If there's anything I've taken from it, it's that the people who decide you don't count are almost never the people whose count was worth having, and that being seen, even late, even by someone who can no longer answer you back, is worth more than being agreed with by a whole room of people who never once looked. Have you ever been made small by the very people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever mistaken disappearing for keeping the peace? Have you ever had to stand your own size and let the truth stand next to you? If you know someone who's spent years being the quiet one in a room that never once looked, send them this story. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for a person is be the one who finally sees them. Because that's the whole of it. In the end, not to win, and not even to be agreed with. Just to be seen quietly, and for real. And if you were seen here, even for a second, leave one word below. Seen. So I know you were here. Take care of yourself. Pull the ones who didn't do the harm out onto the water with you. And I'll see you on the next one.